Welcome to VSOW. The core concept we are diving into today is, well, it's urgent and it's deeply personal. What happens to your sense of control, to your reality, and maybe even to your own thoughts when algorithms become the dominant architects of the information you consume? We are moving far, far beyond the simple, the passive filter bubble critique that really dominated the last decade of tech discussion.
That's so right. The material we're looking at today takes us into a much more profound space. I'd even say a more unsettling space. It's just no longer about whether you see different news than your neighbor. The real question now is whether you believe the content you're seeing is even real, and whether your mind itself is the next target for strategic intervention.
And that's the core of it. This deep dive focuses on that huge transformation, the psychological, the philosophical, and even the geopolitical shift that's happening, because we are now aware of these algorithmic systems. We're basically tracing the shift from, let's say, accidental algorithmic influence to conscious engineered control.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to unpack the critical mechanisms behind what we're calling algorithmic compliance versus resistance. We'll be examining how AI is restructuring the very concept of authenticity. There's a mechanism for this called the inversion, we'll get into. And crucially, we're going to detail how this technology is being harnessed by military discourse to try and predict and maybe even intervene in the very formation of human thought and emotion. It's a chilling concept the literature calls algorithmic governmentality.
Our sources for this are really a fascinating constellation of perspectives, which is exactly what a deep dive like this needs. We're synthesizing insights from, on the one hand, rigorous lab experiments on user behavior. On the other hand, we have critical theory that fundamentally questions the nature of reality itself. And then we have these detailed analyses of U.S. military strategic assessments on, of all things, the convergence of neurobiology and AI. So it's this thorough investigation into the rapidly dissolving boundaries between the human and the machine, and we'll be going into extensive detail on all three of those fronts.
And we begin with, I think, the most fundamental question affecting your daily interaction with these platforms. When you know an algorithm is recommending content to you, do you instinctively resist it? Or do you comply with it? The answer, according to the research we've analyzed, it depends entirely on one crucial factor. It depends on whether you know what you're looking for. Okay, let's unpack this by looking at the human psychology at work here.
Right, so we're starting at the micro level, the individual experience.
Sure.
Specifically, the psychological landscape of interacting with these algorithms. Our first source, it defines a really critical starting point for this whole discussion. Algorithmic awareness, or AA as they call it.
Algorithmic awareness is, it's defined as the individual's perception and, I guess, speculation regarding the existence, the operational logic, and the social impact of algorithms in their media environment. And the research confirms what we probably all suspect, For the vast majority of users, daily usage often happens in a state of what they call algorithmic unconsciousness.
Algorithmic unconsciousness, that's a great term.
It is. The systems are so integrated, so seamless that we stop thinking about them. They become invisible.
But then once that awareness gets activated, once you know there's this automated system suggesting what you see, a really fundamental behavioral dilemma emerges. And the research confirms this divergence. Some users, their gut reaction is to resist the recommendations.
Right, and that's often rooted in concerns we hear about all the time, worries about privacy breaches, the fear of being pigeonholed, being put in a box, or even actively resisting what they see as the algorithmic marginalization of their identity.
And that resistance can be quite sophisticated.
It can, but while resistance is a critical behavior, the study we're looking at really wanted to find the underlying psychological pathways driving the other side of that coin. The often passive compliance behaviors. They wanted to know what makes people actively cooperate with the machine.
And we really need to clarify that compliance isn't always just passive ignorance. It's not just blindly following. The sources define compliance behaviors as users who actively utilize algorithmic rules to efficiently get the results they want. They see the algorithm as a helpful, rational tool.
That's a key distinction. But you mentioned sophisticated resistance, and the research cites some fascinating examples. For instance, they mentioned TikTok users who engaged in this deliberate resistance. They would intentionally click on totally unrelated content, or they'd post videos that aligned with their specific real-world identities.
All to push back against the algorithm trying to generalize them.
Exactly, to push back against the marginalization of their niche interests. That's a highly sophisticated digital strategy, not just some gut reaction of, I don't like this.
It's an attempt to train the algorithm, in a way.
It's an attempt to master the system. But when we look at why people comply, the study focuses on two core components of what they call the algorithmic empowerment experience. And those are perceived power and locus of control.
Okay, so let's clarify those classic psychological concepts in this new digital context. Perceived power seems straightforward enough. It's the subjective feeling, your gut feeling, of your ability to influence or control the outcomes the platform is showing you. Do you feel like you have agency in the system?
Right. And locus of control, which stems from Rotter's pioneering work in psychology, dictates where people believe control over events resides. So you have internals who believe they control outcomes through their own effort, their skill, their choices. And then you have externals who believe results are caused by forces beyond their personal control. Things like fate, destiny, or, broad societal systems.
And the research argues that these two concepts aren't just related to compliance, but that they are critical mediators. They're the things that determine whether your awareness of an algorithm leads you to resist or to willingly comply.
Precisely. They form the psychological pathway.
So how on earth did they test such a delicate balance? It seems very difficult to isolate.
They used a controlled laboratory setting. They had 68 participants in what's called a 2x2 mixed factorial design.
Which means they were testing for two things at once.
Yes. The presence or absence of algorithmic awareness and the presence or absence of a clear browsing purpose.
And they were incredibly meticulous. I noticed they even used curated, effectively neutral reading materials.
They had to. They used simple daily life materials for the purposeless browsing group and then specific film and TV materials for the purposeful browsing group. And the goal there was to ensure that emotional variables didn't skew the cognitive results about agency and control. They wanted to isolate the rational mind, so to speak.
And did it work? Was the awareness actually activated?
It was. The manipulation check was crucial, and it was successful. The group that was told their information was being algorithmically filtered reported a significantly higher belief in that filtering. They registered a mean of 4.69 on their scale, compared to the no awareness group, which was down at 2.50.
So they successfully isolated the variable of awareness.
Correct. And, just as importantly, the emotional state of both groups remained neutral throughout the entire test. This allowed them to really focus on the purely psychological variables of purpose and power.
And this is where the major insight lies. The key finding on compliance level, which is visualized so clearly in the experimental data. When the participants were told there was an algorithm present, when that algorithmic awareness was activated, their compliance with the recommendation was significantly higher during purposeful browsing.
Yes, a mean of 5.83 compared to 5.44 during purposeless browsing. A noticeable jump.
But the comparison that's even more revealing is when you look at the group that had no algorithmic awareness, the control group.
That's the key. In that group, there was virtually no significant difference in compliance between their purposeful browsing, which was at 4.75, and their purposeless browsing at 4.91.
Okay, so let's just pause on the implications of that jump. When people knew the algorithm was there, and they had a clear goal like, I need to find information on this specific topic, their compliance shot up by almost a full point on the scale compared to when they thought the results were just random.
And when they thought the system was random, having a purpose made almost no difference to their behavior.
That's a huge finding.
The interpretation is, I think, very clear. Knowing the algorithm is present, but having a clear goal leads to the highest compliance because the algorithm is immediately seen as a rational tool. It's seen as a tool to achieve that goal efficiently. It becomes an extension of the user's own cognitive process.
Right. You're delegating the work. It's what the researchers call delegated agency. You're outsourcing the whole filtration process to the machine because you think it will get you there faster.
Yeah.
But the core mechanism here isn't just about efficiency. It's psychological. And that idea of delegated agency brings us to the mediating mechanism, which explains the specific psychological flow that's happening. The study tested for these chain mediating effects, and the significant pathway they established for purposeful browsing was this. Algorithmic awareness leads to perceived power, which leads to internal control, which finally leads to compliance.
This is truly critical. I mean, what it means is that awareness, when you pair it with a defined goal, doesn't trigger fear or resistance. It generates a subjective sense of perceived power.
You feel like you're in charge.
The individual feels capable of influencing the system because they are consciously inputting a specific demand. And this sense of power, in turn, triggers a strong sense of internal control. The belief that you are still the master and you can ultimately control the outcome.
So the compliance isn't this passive surrender at all. It's an active choice, and it's based on a sense of mastery over the system. The individual perceives they can control and manipulate the algorithm, using it as an assistance tool for their decision-making.
And that delegated agency leads to extremely high compliance because the recommendation is effectively perceived as the result of the user's own optimized self-screening. You think the machine just helped you do what you were going to do anyway, only better.
But we have to challenge the nature of that control, don't we? If the compliance is rooted in perceived power and internal control, isn't that just a kind of self-deception? Does the study address whether that power is real, or if it's merely an illusion that's been delegated by the platform to encourage our engagement?
That's the necessary critical distinction to make. The sources definitely imply a degree of engineering. The system hands you the illusion of the reins to make you more compliant. And you can see this so clearly when you contrast it with the results of purposeless browsing.
Right, where the mediating effect of perceived power was not significant at all.
Exactly. When participants were just aimlessly scrolling through that daily life content, their compliance had nothing to do with delegated agency or internal control. It stemmed from what the researchers call cognitive offloading and attentional inertia.
So you're just kind of coasting.
You're coasting. In the purposeless state, the users are relying on external cues, like the mere order of information that's presented, and they're allowing the algorithm to act as a cognitive substitute. There's no active sense of agency there, only a diminished critical evaluation.
So the insight here, and it's a crucial one, is that when you have a purpose, the algorithm acts as your sophisticated servant. It significantly boosts your instrumental rationality. But when you lack a purpose, when you're just scrolling, you immediately become the algorithm's passive subject.
And you sink into that state of algorithmic unconsciousness where compliance is just passive inertia.
It's a vital lesson in digital hygiene, really. Purpose is your armor against psychological subjection.
It truly is.
Okay, so moving from that individual psychological pathway, we now have to confront the collective philosophical reality being constructed by advanced AI. The research terms this seismic shift, the algorithmic condition.
To really understand the scope of this shift, we need to quickly chart the history of this kind of technological transformation. We can start with mechanical reproduction, which Walter Benjamin famously observed as destroying the aura of original, unique art.
Right, the sense of it being one of a kind.
Exactly. Then we can move through Bernard Stiegler's concept of grammatization, which is basically the externalization and encoding of human memory and cognitive processes into technical systems like writing or, later, photography.
So that's the necessary context, the history of externalizing our minds. But the sources we're looking at argue that the current moment marks a fundamental and qualitative shift from mere reproduction to what's called algorithmic genesis, the autonomous generation of cultural content through computational processes.
And that's the leap. The system is no longer just reflecting human activity. It's creating entirely new and often very alien cultural artifacts.
And the technical mechanism that underpins this creation is defined as diffusionization. This is where the concept gets deeply, deeply unsettling.
It is. Diffusionization is the process where cultural forms are probabilistically dissolved and then reconstituted through computational diffusion processes. Specifically, it uses vector representation and latent space manipulation.
Okay, can you give us an analogy for what that actually means? How does an artifact get dissolved and reconstituted? That sounds like something from science fiction.
Okay, so imagine every human-created cultural artifact, every photograph, every line of text, every piece of music is mapped as a mathematical vector point in a vast multidimensional space. The computer isn't looking at the picture of the cat. It's looking at the mathematical relationships between furriness, whiskers, blue background, composition, and style.
It's all just data points.
All just data points.
Yeah.
Diffusionization takes that massive cloud of mathematical possibility, dissolves the original things it was trained on, and then generates new points between them in that latent space. This allows AI to blend, to morph, and to generate new cultural forms that have no original single referent in human experience. It's creating a statistical chimera.
So it's not based on an existing human gesture or a piece of knowledge. It's a new creation that emerged purely from the statistical void between all those data points. And the resulting cultural artifact is what one source vividly calls AI slop.
It's a necessary descriptor, I think. It refers to the rapid production of low-quality, often unedited AI writing, images, and video that gets pasted online. This content is frequently almost intelligible or uncannily correct, but it's been garbled through those diffusional technologies.
And what happens next is crucial, right? It's not just about the content itself.
No, it's about what it does to us. This forces humans to try and fit that computationally generated, often meaningless content into their existing cultural horizons, into their structures of meaning. It's a distortion that demands cognitive labor from the recipient just to make sense of the void.
And that systemic distortion leads us directly to the core philosophical concept of this section, which is the inversion. I find the history of this term, the fact that it started in an engineering room before it ever evolved into critical theory, to be truly unsettling.
I agree. The term inversion was first used internally by engineers at YouTube around 2013. They realized that AI bot traffic on their platform had reached parity with human traffic. It was 50-50.
And their fear was a practical one.
An immediate practical fear. They were afraid that their fraud detection systems would flip, that they would start treating the consistent, predictable, algorithmic bot behavior as the new definition of real or normal. And in doing so, that genuine, often erratic and unpredictable human behavior would get flagged as fake or anomalous.
And this is where that technical fear just explodes into this profound philosophical weight. The inversion is defined as a broader philosophical and cultural concept where these machine-generated works become functionally indistinguishable from human-created artifacts. And in doing so, they actively reshape our very understanding of authenticity itself.
The inversion creates what the sources call synthetic uncertainty. The moment we cannot reliably discern the source of something, our default cognitive assumption begins to shift. The default assumption becomes that cultural artifacts are computationally generated unless proven otherwise.
And one source suggests this radical outcome, that being AI-generated could potentially be considered more real than being human-created.
It sounds paradoxical, but it's because the machines are optimizing for the metrics engagement, completion rates, virality, that the platform now prioritizes as value.
So if the platform defines reality by its own optimization metrics, then the most optimized output is, by definition, the most real thing in that ecosystem. This logic, it finds concrete economic expression in what is termed automametric production.
Automametric production. It describes these new closed-circuit forms of algorithmic value creation that can bypass human consumers entirely. And the case study is the practice of fake streaming. Here, you have musicians and entrepreneurs who exploit streaming payment infrastructure by using bots to generate endless variations of ambient or functional music through algorithmic composition. It's music specifically optimized for background noise.
And then the human is just entirely removed from the consumption loop.
Precisely. They use automated networks, synthetic audiences, bot farms to continuously stream these tracks thousands and thousands of times for micropayments. The goal isn't human aesthetic experience or enjoyment. It's infrastructure exploitation,
The whole system is designed to extract value from the platform's payment structure.
making human aesthetic experience completely incidental to the process, an afterthought.
That seems like a recursive alienation from cultural production itself. And the scale of this isn't negligible, is it?
Not at all. Estimates from just a few years ago, 2021, suggested that up to 10% of all streams might be artificial.
10%.
10%. So if our culture is increasingly being produced and consumed by machines for the sake of platform economics, what happens to our consciousness?
And that's where we move from the traditional idea of false consciousness to what the sources call post-consciousness.
And this is a really critical distinction. False consciousness, in traditional Marxist theory, was mystification. You don't know the truth, so you internalize the ruling ideology. Post-consciousness is a qualitatively new state where the boundary between your individual consciousness and a synthetic consciousness just blurs. It's not passive mystification or simple mediation anymore. It's a form of consciousness that is partly synthetic, continuously shaped by and exposed to these algorithmically generated forms.
So it's not just that we're being fooled, it's that we know we're being fooled and we still participate anyway. That describes what the sources call the doubling of consciousness.
Yes. Users are simultaneously aware of the synthetic nature of their online connections, whether these are, manufactured authenticity from influencers, parasocial relationships, or even relationships with highly sophisticated chatbots. Yet, at the same time, they remain strongly emotionally invested in them.
We consciously acknowledge the artificiality.
But our emotional brain, our limbic system, treats it as real.
And this has to have dire consequences for critical thought. The sources suggest that the rise of AI diminishes human competence and turns the human condition into pure data. Thought, in this framework, is defeated by computational reason or intelligence. What's the subtle but profound distinction being made here between intelligence and consciousness?
Well, intelligence is defined as the combinatory ability to win the game. It's the optimizing function, pure problem-solving capability. Consciousness, conversely, is defined as the ethical and aesthetic reflection on the game's goals, asking why we are playing this game and what value it holds beyond just winning.
And the two are decoupling.
Actively decoupling. The sources suggest that in the highly competitive game of economic or political dominance, consciousness, with its need for ethical reflection and, messy human goals, can actually be a hindrance to optimized intelligence.
That notion that computational reason is actively defeating human consciousness and that human consciousness is becoming a competitive disadvantage carries a specific, deep cultural weight. The Germans have a word for that feeling, the Unheimlich.
The unheimlich. It's a profound, hard-to-translate concept. It means sinister, disquieting, or just profoundly uncanny. It describes the perception of the coexistence of fundamentally incompatible realities, where the familiar backdrop of the modern rational promise is just disintegrating.
And in this algorithmic age, what is it that triggers this cognitive uncertainty?
It's the ambiguity of the automaton. It's that simultaneous, glitchy recognition of a living person in the machine, or more frighteningly, a machine in the living person. We're seeing them. Yet the most disturbing philosophical twist is the paradox. The cognitive automaton is simultaneously described as the final, absolute realization of the Enlightenment project. The dream is submitting all of reality to the rule of total predictive rationality.
And the tragic result.
The tragic result, according to the sources, is the relentless expansion of the automaton on the ruins that follow the explosion of psychotic chaos in the social organism. And this is the very condition the military is now trying to exploit.
So we shift now to a fundamentally different source set, military strategy. This section directly addresses the question of how sovereign power is approaching the challenge of this algorithmic mind. Expert critiques of what's called algorithmic governmentality, or AG, have traditionally argued that it represents a clear break from classical biopolitics.
That critique, which is exemplified by thinkers like Rouvroy and Burns, it suggests that AG removes the need to know or affect the human mind at all. The algorithm, in this view, focuses purely on the statistical analysis of observable behavioral patterns, what they call the actualist notion, and is supposedly uninterested in qualitative inner life variables like love, ethics, morals, or care. It just cares about clicks.
But the sources we reviewed present a very powerful counter-argument to that. They argue that AG isn't a break at all, but a far more comprehensive extension of biopolitics. And this extension is formed through an intimate and historical relation between the life sciences, specifically neurobiology, and computer sciences. The distinction between human and machine, they argue, is dissolving, making the mind the new battlefield.
And this historical relationship is absolutely essential context. We have to look at the neurobiological analogy. Neuroscientists like Catherine Malibu define the human brain as plastic, correlational, and networked dynamic system. This description is a direct reciprocal analogy to the development of AI.
So the model for one informed the other.
From the very beginning, founders of AI and cybernetics, like Alan Turing and Norbert Wiener, were themselves profoundly inspired by neurobiological theories of the mind and communication. They established this deep connection decades ago. The machine was designed in the image of the brain, or at least how the brain was understood at the time.
This convergence brings us to the absolute core of this section, the U.S. Department of Defense's Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Program, or the SMA program. What is the practical, operational mission of this program?
The SMA program, which is sponsored by the DoD, has an explicit mission. It is to conjoin cutting-edge science on the human brain with AI insights to achieve more precise prediction, identification, and most critically, preemption of political violence. Their aim is to move strategic intervention further left of bang.
Left of bang, meaning
Not just intervening before an explosion, but intervening before the formation of the very idea to create the explosion.
And the precondition for this is a redefinition of the human. So how do SMA researchers conceptualize the human being in this strategic context?
They define the human as an evolved machine. The difference from artificial intelligence, in their view, lies not in how intelligence operates, it's all correlational and computational, but simply whether it is evolved, meaning biological, or engineered, meaning synthetic.
And so ideas.
Ideas, therefore, are explicitly viewed as nothing more than networks of neurons with a material, corporeal ontology. Everything a person does or thinks or feels is reduced to the result of quantifiable, measurable neuron activity.
So they're collapsing the distinction between social theory and neuroscience. They're trying to bring hard science to social interactions in the pursuit of security. This required a critical synergy between two fields that were previously pretty disparate.
It did. Early SMA work around 2010 found that neuroscience insights alone are just too basic for real-world application in national security. But they correctly predicted that big data would act as a force multiplier to achieve operational readiness. The convergence of neurobiology and computational science would, they believed, finally allow the military to confront what was previously considered qualitative and resistant to prediction, namely social interactions and human emotions.
And this convergence enables their ultimate, deeply ambitious goal, surveilling potentiality via neurodata. We need to take a moment to define this strategic term thoroughly.
Neurodata is the large-scale collection of multiscalar information. It's designed to establish detailed predictive assessments of brain structure and function across entire populations. And this is highly technical. It includes data from physical devices like high-resolution MRI scans, EEG, which is electroencephalography, and FNIRS, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which measures brain activity through blood flow.
But it's not just about physical scans of individuals, is it? It also includes systemic population-wide metrics.
Absolutely. They are also interested in measuring neurotransmitters and hormone levels, specifically in molecules like oxytocin, which they see as a trust modulator that influences affiliation and bonding.
Or dopamine.
Or dopamine, which is related to motivation, well-being, and altruistic behavior. These are seen as the biochemical levers that impact affective and political states across a population.
And what specific cognitive variables are all these physiological measurements being collected to describe?
They're collected to describe an individual's or population's KABIB. It's an acronym for knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, intentions, and behaviors.
Habib.
This set of variables is the military's target for prediction and for intervention. And measuring intentions and beliefs, that is the critical leap. It means they are attempting to quantify the internal subjective state that traditional governmentality was thought to ignore.
This is where the SMA vision just fundamentally refutes that traditional critique of AG. It's not about ignoring the inner life at all. It's about accessing it, measuring it, and targeting it at scale.
Precisely. Neurodata collection is described in the sources as an implicit measure, a means to measure unconscious, involuntary, and often unknown features of the mind. This makes traits we often deem exclusively human memory, trust, empathy, conviction accessible to the machine's quantification.
And the ultimate goal?
The ultimate goal is that this vision allows algorithmic systems to operate directly on the level of potentiality, intervening in the source of the mind, thought, emotions, behavior, before violence or radicalization can even emerge. They are seeking to regulate the formation of political thought itself, moving intervention far, far left of bang.
So if surveillance is the first step, what are the actionable intervention strategies envisioned by the SMA program? How do you regulate an evolving machine?
A primary focus is on the power of narratives. Narratives are seen as attractors that drive mental model formation in the brain. They're identified as key tools for both radicalization and counter-radicalization because they work by acting so intensely on the emotional register of the brain, appealing to fundamental needs like love, belongingness, and group solidarity. They are, in this view, biochemical levers.
So the goal is to identify which narrative attracts which brain profile and then to automate the deployment of a counter-narrative.
Exactly. Models like Neurant, which stands for neurointelligence, use algorithmic systems trained on vast amounts of narrative data to identify individuals to be targeted by individualized countermessaging. And to ensure maximum effectiveness, they stress test these messages before deployment using a mechanism called a human-in-the-loop stress test.
Okay, you have to explain that mechanism because that sounds ethically fraught, to say the least.
It is. It's a literal neuromarketing technique applied to state security. They connect psychological and physiological monitoring systems, like EEG sensors, to the brains of representatives of the population, individuals who fit the target profile. And they monitor their real-time neural responses while they are exposed to these countermessages.
So it's an immediate, objective feedback loop.
To optimize the message's emotional and cognitive impact before it's deployed broadly across populations. They are optimizing influence operations by measuring the subject's unconscious brain activity.
That is surveillance, eliminating the gap between research and action.
Yeah.
What about the future imaginaries that are detailed in the sources? Where does this go?
By 2031, the future plans include using immersive technologies like VR and AR to create newly manufactured realities that are so effective the target audience forgets they're even an audience. But the most radical step is the envisioned use of neurotechnological devices, brain-machine interfaces, inspired by technologies like Neuralink to translate neurological signals into computer inputs and vice versa, which would eliminate the gap between surveillance and intervention altogether. It would allow for direct, real-time modification of the human cognitive machine.
But this entire apparatus of intervention, it hinges on a definition of freedom and security that is utterly opposed to what Western tradition typically calls free will.
It is. The SMA program fundamentally rejects the concept of free will. It perceives it merely as a neurological firing pattern that's open to statistical analysis and subsequent intervention. And this leads directly to the extraordinary paradox of freedom and security that they articulate. The deployment of neurologically informed counter-messaging is articulated not as control, but as an act of freedom.
An act of freedom.
Yes. The goal is articulated as enabling the optimization of human life and ensuring that the vulnerable do not fall prey to non-optimized, radicalizing narratives. Freedom, in this context, is defined as optimized compliance with the state's security goals.
The military's imaginary, then, is one where security necessitates the continuous, never-ending regulation of society, what the sources call no war, no peace.
Exactly, because the potential for violence, which they see as inherent in human neurological plasticity, is perpetually present and must be managed like a chronic condition.
Okay, we must now pull these three deeply connected threads: the psychological compliance, the synthetic reality, and the military optimization. We need to pull them together to understand the critical challenges facing you, the informed citizen.
The first tension we identified, even within the benign setting of that laboratory experiment in the first section, was the ongoing conflict between what's called instrumental rationality and value rationality.
Right, IR versus VR.
Instrumental rationality, or IR, is what algorithms are designed to enhance. They efficiently match your preferences with relevant content. They facilitate goal-oriented decision-making, which is precisely why purposeful browsing leads to such high compliance. The machine is an efficient tool. IR is all about optimized means to an end.
But algorithms fundamentally undermine value rationality, VR. They narrow our informational exposure. They shape our choices based on opaque commercial criteria. And this dramatically dilutes our critical engagement with broader societal values and reduces choices to these platform-mediated, pre-selected options. It's what one source accurately calls optionalism. You feel like you're choosing, but the menu was written by the algorithm.
And the danger posed by the intersection of these two rationalities is the drift into algorithmic unconsciousness, which we saw dominating that purposeless browsing condition. Excessive reliance risks abandoning judgment entirely. To navigate this world, we have to strike a proper balance between human subjective initiative and the purely instrumental nature of these algorithms. Moderate compliance is sometimes efficient, but critical reflexivity must be maintained as a constant.
But if the underlying reality itself is being structurally remade by the inversion, by synthetic media that is algorithmically generated and indistinguishable from human work, how can we even apply traditional critical thought? If the map is the territory, the distinction between the surface and the underlying reality is incredibly hard to maintain.
And this challenge, it necessitates a completely new methodology, which the sources call constellational analysis. This approach, it's inspired by Walter Benjamin's analysis of the Parisian arcades, and it requires analyzing multiple intersecting moments: the technical code, the social usage, cultural effects, economic infrastructure, all simultaneously.
So instead of studying a single piece of content, you have to treat the algorithmic platform itself as a crystallization point, where computational systems, capital flows, and human desire all intersect.
That's it, exactly. For example, analyzing automometric production, that fake streaming phenomenon, it requires examining the bot networks, the specific programming code used for the algorithmic composition, the transformation of attention economies, the new value chains being established, and the resulting reshaping of aesthetic experience, all in one constellation.
And this complexity demands what the source calls an inversional critique.
It does.
What does that kind of critique entail?
It's a method that has to operate simultaneously at the technical, the cultural, and the infrastructural levels. It requires maintaining critical distance and reflecting on the transformation of reality while acknowledging how computation is transforming the very possibility of critical consciousness itself. We have to be conscious of our own post-consciousness as we critique it.
Let's bring this directly back to the most critical implications for you, the informed participant living in this algorithmic condition. The first major implication that's discussed is this new form of economic and social inequality that results from synthetic uncertainty.
This is the stratification of verification. Because synthetic content is becoming so prevalent, because the inversion is completing, a new social stratification will arise based on who can afford proprietary verification systems. Things like advanced watermarking or cryptographic proofs to distinguish synthetic content from human content.
And this just deepens existing social divides.
It creates a class gulf between those who can afford to access a verified reality and those who have to navigate a synthetic and potentially malicious mediascape.
Beyond that, we really need to internalize the fact that we're no longer singular individual thinkers. We are now functioning within vast cognitive assemblages.
Cognitive assemblages are these complex interactive systems where humans and cognitive technical systems, and that's everything from traffic control algorithms and trading algorithms to the recommendation engines we've been discussing, interact and collectively transform life on Earth. The key idea here is that cognition is broader than human consciousness. It's pattern recognition that's applicable to all life and all technical systems. You are not a solitary thinker. You are a critical, biologically based node in a vast, interactive, co-evolving system.
So if we are now part of the machine, what is the most effective form of resistance that preserves human agency without just collapsing into, Luddite denial?
The primary resistance is against the reduction of social life to platform-mediated options. It's resisting optionalism. Resistance means developing what the sources call algorithmic determinant, drawing on situationist theory.
So redirecting the system's tools.
Exactly. Actively developing practices that redirect computational systems toward democratic and explainable forms of life. Think of federated social networks, collective knowledge projects, or creating post-screening communities that fundamentally exist outside of platform capitalism's logic. The goal is to force the algorithm to serve human goals, not the other way around.
This has been a deeply challenging deep dive, moving from the microscopic psychology of browsing behavior all the way to the macroscopic military intent to regulate the human brain at a neurological level.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the SMA program reveals a vision of security where war is never ending, it's omnipresent, and it requires the continuous regulation of society. So if military discourse is already imagining a world where the goal is not to address the material causes of violence like poverty or political grievance, but to regulate how those conditions are coded in the brains of vulnerable populations, then how do we ensure that human flourishing, authentic ethical reflection, and democratic process, rather than mere algorithmic optimization, remain the central organizing principle of our global society? That is the profound question we're left with.
Today, we synthesized insights from psychological experiments, showing how algorithmic awareness boosts compliance when it's paired with purpose, through critical theory detailing the creation of synthetic reality through the inversion, and finally into military strategic analysis, detailing the ambitious goal of controlling human potentiality through neurodata and algorithmic governmentality.
And this knowledge empowers you to engage with technology not just as a consumer passively accepting recommendation, but as an informed participant capable of critical reflexivity, resisting that drift into algorithmic unconsciousness by constantly asking, what is my purpose and who is serving whom?
We invite you to continue your deep dive by subscribing to VSOW wherever you get your content. Please like this episode and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on where you see the greatest threat: the psychological pressure of algorithmic compliance or the geopolitical ambition of algorithmic governmentality.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.